Good afternoon and welcome again to the Veterans Forum. Today is September 9, 2010. We have sharing the mics and the stage with us today another fellow who did his job. He'll explain it and we'll take it from there. I'll introduce Jim as Jim, but would you then please your full name and spell your last name for us?
Gerald James Fawcett, F-A-W-C-E-T-T.
And where do you now live, please?
Tyringham, Mass.
Okay. Now, what was your branch of service and the dates, if you will? Then just go from there.
Okay. 1962 to 68, I was a reservist in the Medical Corps. And shall I just sort of back up? Or
back up, and if we get you started today, if you will, then I'm going back and build a little history as to how you came to be where you are now.
Okay. Well, I was born in 1939. And my earliest recollections essentially have to do with things that were wartime. And as I can recall, the services that we did not have during wartime because of the wartime shortages were just around me all the while. As a young kid, I would go to the movies, cost a dime. This is in Ridgewood, New Jersey. And I was fascinated because all the newsreels, of course, were of World War II. Mm-hmm. And when I was 4 or so, I would go down to the grocery with my mother and grandmother, and to see what we could or couldn't get, and it was mostly could not get.
The ration books.
Absolutely, the ration books. And I can remember taking a tin can. The cans were really made of tin back then. And when we had a piece of meat, which was rare, we would take the drippings and take it to the butcher to be turned into explosives. That was
turning the fat back.
Absolutely. And in the movies, it always began with singing the national anthem. The flag would go up, so anyway, during the war, in summers, we had a couple of summers in a place called Oak Beach in Long Island. And there were no, it was very simple. There was no running water. You had to pump your own water. There was a cesspool out back and all that sort of thing. And I can recall that occasionally we'd be on the beach there and there would be the great clots of oil. And I would look around and say, what's that from? I said, oh, well, that's another boat that had been torpedoed. Yeah, all that sort of thing. Fire was a big deal in the little community there. Because there was no running water. And so if there was a fire and the cottages would go up easily, people would ring the alarm and all this kind of stuff. Well, it so happened that some kids were playing with something on the beach, and it were these emergency flares that had washed up on the beach. And so here were these clouds of orange smoke and all this kind of stuff. And so the word went out, fire. And as kids, our job was to go to the various cottages and beat on the door and shout fire. Well, people would just pour out, with their shovels and their brooms and all this kind of stuff. And that's to discover that it was a false alarm, so to speak. And at the very end, it's just 1945, I can remember someone had a portable radio, a battery-driven radio. And I can remember sitting on the back step of the cottage, and I looked off and saw this boy that I knew, and he was running over the sand dunes, shouting hysterically. He said, "Oh my God, is it another fire situation, so to speak?" Waving his arms and waving his arms, and finally he got close enough, and what he was shouting was, "The war is over."
Amen.
Yes, and everybody came out, and so that was really my life. And in the beginning there, and I can remember my father, we were on a ferry, I think it was the East River, and there were the fire ships there and all this kind of stuff and parades, and this was just very wonderful. And then interestingly, in a couple of years later, as we would go up on the train on the Hudson, I would look out and I said, "Dad, what are all these ships?" And there was row after row after row. They're all the Liberty ships, that were waiting to be cut up. So anyway, that was part of my early life. You were asking about my family and was there any service in my family. Thinking back, I did have a great-grandfather, I guess it is, who was in the Spanish-American War. And the family name there was Thompson, Thompson. And I learned recently from someone who was a shirt-tail relative, she's 85 now, I think, she wrote me and was telling me about the Thompsons. Well, David Thompson, I think it was, in 1620, was one of the early people to come into Boston Harbor. And of course, when you come to a new land, you want to put your stamp on it. And in point of fact, he claimed an island in Boston Harbor as his. And you can look on a map, and there's Thompson Island.
For real?
Yeah, for real. Absolutely.
Wonderful. New history.
There we go. There we go. My family was from the Midwest, Minnesota. And they were, my mother, my grandmother's husband had died early. And so my grandmother was a teacher, and she got hooked up with a group of actors and traveling actors. And so my mother went along with that. And they would spend the summers on the farm, and there was no money. And there were World War I tents, that were these huge tents that were put up. And the various relatives would come and stay on the farm. And
live in tents?
Live in tents. Yeah, that was it. You know, I mean, they didn't have much of anything. My mother put her way through college by playing in the silent movie theaters. She played the piano. Oh. And there'd be the screen up here, and she'd be facing the screen, and she would look at what was going on, and she would play.
Kind of fake it.
Well, yeah, I mean, she would, play whatever.
Okay.
Okay. So she was the first to go to college on that side, Hamlin College there, and my father was not one of the first, but he went to Northwestern. He and my uncle were too old, so to speak, for service in World War II, although the factory that he worked for was a vice president in, called the Flint Coat Company, and they had to do with armaments and things like that with tanks. I can remember him taking me to the company on a weekend and burning up precious gasoline. And he showed me one of the tanks that was being outfitted there, and he dropped me inside this tank. Well, of course, it was pitch black, and I was terrified, and I was hitting my head on various things in there, and finally he fished me out, and I thought, oh, that's all I want to do with tanks.
That's enough of that.
Yeah, but that wasn't all there was to it. So anyway, war was fascinating to me. I went to school in Ridgewood, New Jersey, and I was bored out of my mind there. And finally, the teacher in my 6th grade year, she's had enough. And so she, whenever she could, she would send me to the library. That was a good way to get rid of Gerald. And it was wonderful, because all of these books were coming out about the war. And one of the books that I read about was a fellow called F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Flying Tigers. Mm-hmm. I thought he was the nuts, God is my co-pilot and all this kind of stuff. And I was reading about him and how he in the 30s had taken a motorcycle trip through Europe and through Turkey. And I thought, that really is something else, which I actually did later on, but that's another story. Anyway, when I was 10, my father died. We moved to Florida, Central Florida, because it was cheaper living, so to speak. And I went to the high school there, 7th grade high school. And I was a Yankee, okay? And this was the segregated South. This was 1950. And this was all very, very unusual to me. And of course, in the assemblies, the band would be there. And in the very beginning of the assemblies, the first thing they would play was Dixie. And everybody would stand up and shout and sing, and I thought it was, pretty interesting. So 1954 comes along, okay? And the Brown versus the Board of Education. And, it was mandated that the band would play the national anthem. Well, the band sawed their way through the national anthem. And at the very last note, they would hit Dixie. Everybody would stand up. But so one of my friends looked at me and said, but Fawcett, you're a Yankee. Why are you getting so I sat down. So here was like 580 people standing there, sitting there.
Uncle Jim.
Exactly. Yeah, I was
the Jim Crow, if you will.
That's right. Oh yes. Oh, those were very definitely the Jim Crow years. White only, colored this. It was. And that to me is a very much part of, I'm a school teacher. And there was so much that was happening back then. It was so exciting and had a lot of promise to it, but also a huge amount of sadness. Here you had, I found this out years later, and I incorporate this with my teachings with my kids now, that the Tuskegee Airmen, it was fascinating. Eleanor Roosevelt heard that there was this group of flyers at Tuskegee, and she went to Tuskegee, and she went up to, as I understand it, this black pilot, and she said, "Is this what you fly?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am, it is." And she said, "Well, you're going to take me up." And of course, my God, here is the president's wife. Yeah. So up she went, down she came, and she goes to her husband and says, "Franklin, these guys have got to fly." Right. And that's when it all got established. And anyway, my understanding of this, they were blocked over and over and over again, but finally got to North Africa, and then finally got to Italy. And you know the history of their amazing feats. They never lost a plane.
That's right.
They themselves, the fighters were shot down, but they never lost a plane. But when they came back on the troop ships, as I was reading, here they were, they'd done all this sort of stuff. They come down the gangplank, and once again, there were the signs. White this way, yeah. Colored that way. And I had no idea that they essentially, those men, were like the underpinning of the civil rights movement. They said, that's it. We did our thing, and things are going to change.
They have to change.
They have to change, and it's just so unbelievably impressive that way. Anyway, down south, everybody is familiar with firearms. I mean, that's just part and parcel of it. And so we could get our licenses early, and you could get a restricted license at 14, a full license at 16. And of course, we would, I would say to Mom, "Oh, okay, the fellows, we're going to the beach." Well, and we, hop in the car, and then of course, as we go around to, my good friend Rusty, he had an unbelievable arsenal. So we'd sort of chuck weapons in the back of the car. I shouldn't say this too loudly. And as we would go to the beach, of course, the signs became even more Swiss cheese. Exactly. So
deer crossing.
Right. And if you're down south, you shoot. That's all there is to it.
That's given.
Right. But anyway, the public school, segregated, was I had a good time. Buddy Holly, all the really good music and all that kind of stuff was coming out, and I had some very pleasant girlfriends, but the education wasn't. And so I finally said to down south, everybody goes to church, period. Okay, and so I used to meet this fellow on holidays, and his name was Henry Loudon. He was the son of the Bishop of South Florida, and I would talk to him, and he did weird things as I did, like read, listen to good music and all that kind of stuff. And I said, "Henry," I said, "why aren't you in Winter Park High?" And he said, "Oh, I'm going to this school in Western North Carolina." And I said, "What is it?" Well, it was Christ School. It was an Episcopal boarding school. It was a work school. We shoveled the coal, we cut the corn, we chopped the trees, we washed the dishes, all this kind of stuff.
So it was a working tuition.
Yeah, and so this was in my 11th grade year at Winter Park High, and I said to my mother, I'm dying, get me out of here. And so I retook my 11th grade year, and then my 12th grade year at Christ School. It was the beginning of my education, and it was really wonderful. And then I applied to colleges, 4 colleges. I only saw one, which was Emory, that was a particularly interesting situation. As I was being driven around campus, if you find out a lot if you just keep your mouth shut and listen to what people say.
Amen.
Really. And so we were going down, the fraternity row, and I said, okay, here are all of these Greek houses, and I looked down another road there, and I said, well, what about all those Greek houses? And he said, oh, those are for the other people. And I said, what do you mean, the other people? Oh, those are the Jewish fraternities. Interesting.
Oh, another bias.
Yeah, there we go. So there are lots of separation here. So anyway, I was accepted at Harvard and went. It was a total culture shock. I was a little boy from the middle of nowhere, and but I, managed to slug my way through the freshman year. Came home, and I didn't know it, but my mother had contracted breast cancer. And so she and I and my grandmother were living in this house in Winter Park. And I don't know that I fault the doctor on this, but we never had a talk. And I had no idea that, what cancer can do to people in terms of their mind as much as anything else. And so she had an operation and all this kind of stuff. And I painted the house. And was getting all set to go back. And I thought she was a little funny. And so one afternoon we went down town. She sat very quietly in the car. Then the next day I was off seeing a girlfriend, came back to the house, and there was a police car in the driveway. And she just couldn't see her way out. She'd just gotten so far down. And so she had prior to this, as you can easily do in Florida, picked up a pistol, and she had shot my grandmother and then herself, and I was the second car on the driveway, and so I've never been in combat, but I have seen death, and it was I just felt absolutely cold and numb for at least a year after that. That was something else. So anyway, let's get to the Army stuff. So I go to back to school. That was a long year, my sophomore year.
What year was it, please?
That was I went there I graduated in '57, so that would have been 1958, I guess, 1958. And so I started my junior year, and that was it. I talked to the house tutor and all this kind of stuff, and he persuaded me to keep trying. Mm-hmm. And so a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving, I went in and he looked at me and he said, "Well, when are you leaving?" He just knew it was over. So I had very few relatives, and I phoned up my great aunt and great uncle. They lived on a farm in southern Minnesota, and they said, Come on, Jim." And so I landed there quite literally on Thanksgiving Day, and my great uncle had come back to his little farmhouse to get another can of tuxedo tobacco, and so that was his thing. So anyway, everybody embraced me, and it was wonderful and all that kind of stuff, and so I kept thinking back to F. Scott Fitzgerald. I really felt that I had to, do something, get away, and in the attic of this is a little farmhouse, and the upstairs floor, there were only 2 floors, a little tiny place, wasn't heated. That was my bedroom. And so if it was 30 below outside,
lots of blankets.
It was about 20 below. Oh, yeah, it was in there. But anyway, they had some old National Geographics, literally from the 1930s. So I got thumbing through those, and I said, "That's what I'm going to do. I've got to get out of here. I've got to travel." So I got a Sears Roebuck catalog, looked in there, and sent off for a horsehide motorcycle jacket. Got that. Got all my shots, and went to Europe. And started in January, and I landed in England, Southampton, and it was night, and the baggage was all being offloaded, and one of the nets broke, and I thought to myself, "Oh, those poor suckers, it was my stuff."
Yeah. Who else?
That's right, precisely. So anyway, I finally bought a motorcycle in France, and headed off, and I made it as far as Syria. On that, and then I really felt it was one of those kind of things that I just felt I had to exhaust myself, and so I ran. I just literally ran, and so I got to the Syrian border, where went through France and Italy and Greece and Bulgaria, which was just open then, Turkey, and down to Syria. And I got to the border there, and the fellow looked at my papers and said, "You don't have the right papers." Well, evidently, I didn't have the right papers for my motorcycle, but the other border guards didn't have enough English to tell me that. So they just kept shoving me on, further and further and further and further. One tiny detail. I got out of Bulgaria, which was very, very creepy, and into Turkey, and I looked up and I was looking around and said, where are the border guards? Well, there was the building where the border guards were, and the double doors were open. And I looked up, and here was the officer there, and he said, oh, wait, and here was the soldier who had put his rifle down and his helmet and all this kind of stuff. Well, he was taking shots, soccer shots on the officer. So the guy wound up, and the officer dove for the ball and then went inside, and he said, okay, come on. What a relief, that this was sort of human people. Anyway, so we got back. Then I met my roommate, one of my roommates there, Peter Bloom, and we sold a motorcycle and bought a VW and toured around for another 3 months, and then got back to Cambridge, and where I began my junior year. And this is where I've been married for 49 years, 4 children, and so I was at the Episcopal Center there, 0 Garden Street, and with a friend having a sarsaparilla, and these 2 women walked through the room, and I looked up and I said, who is that? Well, that was Eugenie Rudd, and she was going to Radcliffe, and so I had to find out who that was. And so anyway, I did. I tracked her down in the Radcliffe Library, went up to her, and I said, I introduced myself. I'm Jim Fawcett, and I saw you in the Canterbury House, Episcopal Center there, and could we chat? So in Harvard Square, there are these cafeterias. There are a series of cafeterias. Oh, yeah. The Hayes Bickford was one of them. So I took her to the Hayes Bickford, and we ordered a milkshake each and a hamburger. And so she asked me some questions, and I got blabbing. And so finally I paused for a second, and I looked down. She'd eaten my hamburger and her hamburger. She'd had her shake and my shake, and I thought, maybe there's something going on here. Yeah. So that was great. So anyway, she and I proposed to her. At that point, I had signed up to go to British East Africa from the Phillips Brooks House at Harvard. And so she said, go, and so I went to British. They were on the verge of the independence movement there, Uhuru.
Were you an exchange student or a
teacher? I went there to teach. I went there to teach. And the little town of Dodoma, very interesting. There wasn't a single business in Dodoma owned by an African. They were all run by Indians. And, that was just, and of course, with Uhuru, the people, the Africans who came into power there said goodbye to all the Indians, which was a big mistake because they knew how to run things.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was a very interesting experience to me, and the whole idea of colonialism and who was doing it and who was doing it fairly well. We got talking about the Belgians and the French and the Brits. Came back and got married. September 16th, our wedding anniversary is coming up. It's almost always around the time of the Josh Billings, which is anyway.
Competition.
Competition. So at that time, I was getting a little long in the tooth for a student, and Vietnam was starting to, shape up, if you will. And so I knew that I graduated in 1962, but before that, I knew if I didn't do something, Uncle Sam was definitely going to do something. Yeah, and I was not looking forward to my greetings. And I say this to my students. They have no idea what that is. I said, it's a thin envelope, and it comes from the government. It means only one thing. Yeah, exactly.
I gotcha.
That's right. So anyway, I joined up. And those, I felt, were incredibly exciting years. Incredibly exciting years in terms of the civil rights movement, which was getting cranked up. I can remember my English teacher at Christ School. We were talking, and he was talking about this man that he'd read about and the paper that he had written, and of course it was Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. And the ferment was, in many ways very painful, but in many ways extremely positive. I went to the Harvard Law School. We didn't have a TV. I didn't have a TV in 1960. This was before I met my wife, and to see the debates, the Nixon JFK debates, and I was very, very excited about JFK. I really felt that this was a man who was going somewhere. He was smart. He had dedication for his country, and I really believed that, as he said in Berlin, ask not, what the country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I really felt that very, very strongly. But at that time, I was married, and I thought, oh, okay, what am I going to do? And so that's why I joined the reserves, and then went off in 1962 to Fort Dix, and was in the 3rd Training Regiment. And if any of your listeners have been down there, it was interesting because there's nothing permanent in the Army except everything that's temporary. We were in the barracks, the temporary barracks that had been put up for World War I. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so one of my I was in very good shape, and at that time, and a lot of the guys that I was with were cutting their belts, constantly because of all the marching and all that kind of stuff. And I never had to do it once. I really feel very strongly that I'm really sorry that the draft no longer exists. I really feel that, because I think it is an incredibly valuable and deep experience to be with everybody else in the country. Yeah. And to have something to literally contribute to the country, and I'm in Vietnam, did the draft in. I mean, that's all there was to it, and I think this kind of service is a total morale builder and a gift. I think that each person, we won't say men or women, really owes the country in that regard. So anyway, there I was, and I love my M1, and I was a very good shot. When I was going in to get my testing for the service, it was at the Boston Army base. Are you familiar with the Boston Army? Okay, giant place, and it was really very funny because we got there, and a lot of the guys were nervous, so. They all went and peed. And of course, one of the first things they ask you for is a specimen.
Sample, yeah.
Exactly. So we were going in there. And,
2 buckets.
That's it. Anybody got any?
Yeah,
so that was
I'm
really
dry.
good. Yeah. So there was this little room that we went into, 8 of us, and 4 of us lined up, and the Navy corpsman came along with a pencil. And if you were on the left-hand side, you put your finger in your right ear, okay? Mm-hmm. And then he'd tap you, and he said, 8! And if you heard that, you had perfect hearing in that ear. So then he did all of it, and you do an about face, you stick your finger in the other ear, 4! And then everybody, So then came the eye test. And my eyes were terrible at that time, and there was a tunnel, 2 tunnels. And they had to, the machine, it would show the E or the V or whatever it was. And so the sergeant said, okay, son, take off your glasses. And I said, okay, sergeant. And he said, well, what do you see? And I said, I really can't make out what's going on here. And he said, oh, well, walk down the tunnel until you can see what it is. Of course, the partitions were held apart by a rod, which I couldn't see, of course. Okay. I tripped on the rod, did a face plant, and he shouted down, he said, you okay, son? And I said, yeah, I'm okay, sergeant. Come on back. 420 was the cutoff. That's what I got. Okay. So anyway, in basic training, which I kind of enjoyed, I thought it was going to be a whole lot harder than it was. And so anyway, we were going for qualification and all this kind of stuff. So I lay down and shot myself a 3-day pass. And so I was ready to get up. And so he was next. And another fellow came along. He said, stay there, Fawcett, stay there. So I shot 3-day passes for 3 guys. Oh. Yeah, exactly.
What'd you charge them?
No, I didn't. I just thought,
There was a chance.
That was it. That was it. So anyway, in the fall, went in June, and in the fall, I was November. Of course, everybody knows about the uniform change. So we were, you know, one of the things we did to keep the world safe for democracy, on one Saturday, we were carted out in a truck to the golf course, and we were given push mowers.
Oh.
And yes, and we went to trim the greens. That was our you know, doing our thing for the country.
Real rough.
Oh well, but it was raining. It was a miserable day, and there was this Quonset hut nearby, and so we were out there, and it was just, you know, pretty poor, and so this rather large sergeant, you know, steps out and says to us, "Hey boys, you all look cold and miserable." We said, "You know, why don't you come on in?" So, you know, so we, you know, stopped mowing and went into the Quonset hut, and they had his potbelly stove there, and he said, "Oh, you know, boys, you know, I bet you would like something warm to drink." We said, "That's terrific, Sarge." So he gets out a can, and of course, you know, all the cans are labeled, are marked, okay? And so he opens up this can of coffee and you know, starts to make a pot. And I pick up the can. This was tinned in 1914.
Oh. Fresh, unopened.
That's right. And he said, "I bet you'd like something to eat." And I said, "Oh, okay, Sarge, that sounds good too." So he picks up another tin. And he said, "How about brown bread?" I said, "Fine." And so, of course, when he opens it up and takes it out, and so I look up that can. 1917 was when that was tinned.
Oh,
okay?
fresh.
Absolutely, no question about it. So anyway, that was my quote-unquote military experience. I trained at Walson Hospital there, and then came out, and so that was 1963, and we lived in, my wife's family had had a place in Tyringham for a very long time, since in the late 1800s, and so we had she was, let me see, 1963. Our son, well, she was pregnant, and so I got a job at what was then called Lenox School for Boys in Lenox. And believe it or not, in 1963, there were 35 independent schools in Berkshire County. Wow. Then came the 70s, then came the 60s, then came the 70s, and by, I'd say, 1973, there were 5 left.
The rest just died along the way?
Well, it was, well, let me back up a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so 1963, my wife and I, when we were in college, the one thing that really startled me was the absolute explosion of drugs. Now, my wife and I are not real party animals, but not once in all our time at Harvard did we ever have to say no to anything. I mean, yes, there was beer, yes, there was wine, yes, there was hard liquor, but you know, the other stuff, Timothy Leary, of course, was there doing his thing with LSD stuff, but we never had to say no. Within I'd say 2 or 3 years, it really was like a tidal wave. I have never seen anything like it. It just swept through the colleges, swept through Harvard Square, and that was unbelievable, because there were several things that were going on at that time. Being in the Army Reserve, I would, you know, I had to go once a month, and I would come to the dining hall of Lenox School in uniform, obviously, because then I would go off to the reserve meetings. And, you know, and I was following all of this, what was going on in Vietnam, and the nightly news. You watch the nightly news, as horrific as it was, you know, with the body count and all the rest of it. And, you know, it was very interesting because in let me backtrack just for a second here. 1962, later on, I was looking back on the whole civil rights movement, and I thought, why did I miss? Why did I miss the U.S. Army going into Oxford, Mississippi? Well, I was in basic training. That's why I missed it. So I didn't know.
You were there, yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I didn't see it on TV. We didn't. I was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, and I thought to myself, oh, I'm going to be here. I'm going to be in the Army forever, you know, as that was going on. So anyway, this terrific ferment, you know, upheaval, more and more resistance to Vietnam, and I would, through the church at that time, we would have sessions talking with students, talking with young adults about what it all meant, and you know, what seemed to be right, what seemed to be out of place, and Making of a Quagmire. Do you know the book by David Halberstam? Well, everybody was writing then, and then I got more and more interested in the past history, got more and more interested in what the French had done, and in Dien Bien Phu especially. And what interested me, especially with the French, is they did not have, there was a draft in France, but draftees were not sent to Indochina, which was really interesting.
All volunteers?
All volunteers. And a large chunk of it, which I found out, am finding out more of now, were the French Foreign Legion. And the language that was spoken in the French Foreign Legion essentially was German, because there were so many soldiers from the war who couldn't go home or didn't go home and joined the Legion. And what was interesting, and I've just found this out in a book that I'm reading right now, is that a number of the legionnaires who were in Dien Bien Phu had actually made it through Stalingrad and been pulled out of Stalingrad before it fell. So, but anyway, so it was an immensely confusing time, and I knew families where you know the sons were having a very difficult time with the fathers, and you know, should I join up? Should I resist? And you know, there was a coffin at Yale with the draft card burning. You know, it was just tumultuous. And then, you know, to start off, 1963, I can remember coming down from chapel, and we had chapel every evening during the week, and I saw some of the prefects sitting on the this is November, sitting on the steps and listening to their illegal radios. And I said, "What's going on?"
You mean the illegal radio?
Well, yeah, I mean, you weren't supposed to have these what am I trying to say? Little portable radios.
Oh, okay.
And of course, it was the assassination of JFK, and that was just the beginning. So the '60s were just absolutely unbelievable to me, and I, as I say, I felt all the way through that I did have this obligation, but it became harder and harder to really figure out what was going on, and I felt, I mean, I was never sent, but I felt terribly for the men and women who went, and the way they were treated when they came home, and again, fast forwarding some in the 70s, 80s. Well, you know, 70s, 80s in that time period, when there would be the 4th of July parades, there was never a Vietnam vet in those parades, and I felt real anguish for those guys, because they had done their duty. You know,
Absolutely.
they had gone over, and so I, you know, their sense of, I'm sure, confusion, despair, all the rest of it. It was, I thought was very, very intense. So those were hard years, and I know a number of friends of ours, men and women, but especially women, really felt that those years had been stolen from them, the '60s, because of the turmoil, and then of course it all wound up in 1968, you know, with 2 assassinations there, the riots in Chicago. It was some time. There was no question about it. So I'm how should we say? I was a part of it. I wouldn't have it any other way. But I think that to try and follow the twists and turns of that time is very difficult. JFK is assassinated. Johnson comes in. Johnson, he was a politician, and everybody owed him something. Period.
Okay.
Everybody owed Lyndon. He had favors backed up, and then it all went to hell in the Vietnam War. You know, the Great Society just never really
paid up.
No, and because he got swallowed in the black hole. And you know, just so many people got swallowed in that, officers and enlisted men especially, and all the rest of that. And those were hard times.
Yeah. Now, when we talked before, quickly, you went in as an enlisted man.
Correct.
Where along the line did you get your commission, and what was the basis for it? Do you know? Just trying to tie that.
Right, right. I understand. I went up to Spec 4, and then the officers in the unit, you know, said, well, you know, you really should think about becoming an officer. It didn't mean to me something one way or another, and I said, okay,
Yeah,
you know,
I'm yours.
Yeah, exactly, and did the coursework and all that kind of stuff, and became a second lieutenant, and that's kind of an unusual thing. In our summer camps, we would go various places, and one of the last summer camps was down in Blackstone, Virginia, Camp Pickett. I don't know whether you've had the pleasure of being there.
Oh yeah.
And we would go in the evening to the officers' club, and of course everybody else was there from doing their training, and we would chat up the various other officers around. And so one evening I chatted up the fellow who was in charge of the motor pool, and he said, well, Fawcett, you know, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, you know, tomorrow afternoon. He said,
Make me an offer.
Yeah, make me an offer. He said, well, come on over. He said, you want to drive a tank? I said, you kidding? And so I said, sure. You know,
After being dropped one?
after being dropped in. But anyway, so you know, we piled into this tank. I think it was, I may be wrong on this. I think it was an M60. It was big. It was huge. And so you know, away we went. And it was just unbelievable. I mean, to get the thing started, of course, it took, you know, you mashed the accelerator. But once you got one of those things started, it didn't stop very easily. So, you know, we crashed and thrashed our way around the base, and you know, that was a lot of fun. Then another evening, I ran into a couple of warrant officers. I don't know anything about warrant officers except the fact that most of them are absolutely bananas. And these warrants, turns out, well, I guess in Nama, I think a lot of the helicopter pilots were warrants. And it so happened that this warrant was a chopper pilot. And he said, want to go up tomorrow? And I said, yes, sir. And so anyway, the 11th Armored Cav happened to be there, and the RAs, and they were the ones that went into Laos shortly thereafter. And so we went up in the chopper, and he you know, flew us around, and they were just doing maneuvers and things of that nature, and I thought it was all pretty interesting. Going back just a little bit, a number of the students I taught at Lenox School for Boys, I left that school in 1970. Won't go into it, but politics. A number of the students that I taught went to Nam, and you know, they were machine gunners. They were all kinds of things. One fellow, a senior prefect, 1963, Dan Giddings. He and his three brothers were raised by a grandmother in Maine. Really nice kid. Nice and tough, sensible, and no nonsense. And he wound up as an officer in Nam. And we would get postcards. You know, the kids would write us postcards. And you remember? Have you ever seen the Army postcards? Well, they were picture postcards.
Oh.
And this one picture postcard that I got from him was, you know, his APC was going down, and the guys were all lined up. Well, as it so happened that he was in an APC, and you know, the rule of thumb was you never went over the same tracks more than twice, because you know, the VC would zip in, and well, they went over them 3 times, and he I think was eligible for something like a 20% disability, but he said no, and he went right. That was the kind of guy he was. He went right back in, and when he could piece him together, right back into his unit. So I always, it must have been very confusing, I think, for those men, boys as I knew them, to have gone through all of this. But and it's rather interesting, because the the Lennox School Alumni Association has become very strong, and the guys are
They're still active?
Oh, very much so. The school closed in 1972, but in the last 20 years, I'd say, the Alumni Association has been very good. And I was thinking about this in the last couple of days, knowing I was going to be chatting with you. I'm doing the talking. We're not doing much chatting.
I'm doing good listening.
Okay. And I was just thinking about the people who come back to the reunions. Very few of the guys who went to come back, and I don't know why. I don't know why. Let me just give you another little sidebar, and shut me up if I'm rambling too much. It was very interesting to me to read William Manchester's book, Goodbye Darkness. Do you know that book?
No.
It's his experience as a Marine in the Pacific. And he was saying that after he went to the Pacific and talking back about censorship and the papers and all this kind of stuff, and there was a picture that came out in Life magazine, Boona Beach, and it was of these GIs who were on the beach dead. It you know, they were partially covered by sand and stuff like that. I guess there was a huge hue and cry in the press about that, reaction from the public, saying how dare.
Calloused.
Yeah, exactly. But as he was reflecting back on it, and he said, well, what was wrong? They were all whole.
Yeah.
There weren't bits and pieces. Okay. But anyway, he comes back. And he felt that there was this little black man, like this sort of spirit sitting on his shoulder, and he couldn't get rid of it. And this is, I think, in one regard, I'm going to relate this to Vietnam in a minute. And he just couldn't. It just was there, and it was constantly bothering him. So he sits down to write his book, Goodbye Darkness. And once he finished writing about his time in service and what he had seen, the little black man disappeared.
Went away.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, my wife, who was a Latin teacher, showed me a book that was written by a psychologist, and it's called Achilles in Vietnam. I don't know whether you're familiar with that.
My reading has been very, very limited.
Yeah. Well, I teach in translation. I teach the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid at school. And the first time I read the Iliad years ago, I had none of this when I went to Harvard. I was really behind the 8 ball. Well, the first time I read it, I couldn't. What happens is, to be very brief about it, is that you have Achilles, who's simply a born murderer. I mean, that's what he really is. He's not a hero. He's a killer. And then he has his very good friend Patroclus. Achilles is humiliated by the Greek chief Agamemnon, and Achilles won't fight. So anyway, the rest of the Achaeans are not called Greeks. The rest of the Achaeans, his buddies get hurt, and his buddy says, Patroclus says to Achilles, if you won't fight, give me your armor and I'll take your men out. So he dies, and of course, Patroclus winds up dead. Hector, the Trojan, strips the armor from Patroclus, puts it on, and then when Achilles hears that his friend has been killed, he goes absolutely berserk. And the first time I read that, I said, this is not for real. People just don't react that way. I'd not been in combat, okay? And then I got reading, this book by Jonathan Shea, Achilles in Vietnam. And indeed, he was talking to Vietnam vets who were having extreme difficulties with their memories and things of that nature. And he was also a classicist. And so he said, this is exactly what was going on
way back when,
over 3,000 years ago in the Iliad, okay? And so in this book, what he does is he quotes the GIs now from Vietnam, and then he puts parallel passages of the Iliad in there.
Almost a mirror.
Oh, absolutely, and it's totally fascinating. And they're talking about the survivor's guilt. Why couldn't it have been me? you know, the great emptiness. That's what I was talking about before, after my mother died. You know, all of these things, and then trying to have the healing process start. And we went to my wife. Tell me if you want me to stop.
About 3 or 4 more minutes.
Okay. My wife is part of the Classical Association, being a Latin teacher, and so we went to Dartmouth for a week there in the summer, and he came. Jonathan Shea came and spoke, and which was very interesting. And then he played a tape of you know, some of the vets. And having grown up down south, I listened to it very, very carefully. I went up to him afterward and I said, "Excuse me, doctor, but I didn't hear a black voice on that tape. Am I correct in that?" And he said, "That's absolutely right." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. It just seems that the black soldiers take care of themselves." And I said, "Well, I think that's a shame."
Yeah.
Because, you know, a lot of people were saying a lot of important things. So.
Amazing. Okay, let's see, the best way to wrap this up. With all your experiences, do you feel that your service association has had a positive or a negative impact upon your life and how you're living it today?
Oh,
why?
Yeah, I wouldn't have traded it for anything. And I think that I'm constantly talking about this sort of stuff with the kids at school. And you know, how in one sense, with the Civil War, we won the war, we screwed up the peace. We lost the peace. And it took 100 years to get that right, from 1865 to, you know, the Civil Rights Movement. With the World War II, we won the war, but we also won the peace, I think, in that regard, you know, getting Germany and Japan set up, and look where they are now. I mean, they're dynamic economies, you know. So I think it isn't, there's the military part, but then there's also the civilian part.
What is there a way, if you will, cataloging or condensing what your student reactions are to some of the things that you've been able to bring out, either from your own experience or from your teaching, as to what's the state of the world right now? How do they see it?
A lot of this is ancient history to them, but I really feel an obligation as a teacher. You know, essentially the grades that I teach is 6 through 9 right now. This is introductory stuff, and I think, you know, I really feel an obligation to introduce as clearly but gently the ways of the world to them. And because I've seen, you know, I'm 71, and I've seen a number of things, and I think adults really have an obligation to the younger generation to help them get a balanced view, if there is such a thing.
Good point, if there is such a thing. Okay. All I can say is thank you for sharing with us, and we'll hope to hear and see from you again sometime.
Fine and dandy. Pleasure to be here.
Welcome. Oh, you're nice and warm. Stay close. That's a wrap, folks. Again, this is another fellow who did his thing. Each one of us has a little different view, if you will, of this particular elephant. But for those of you guys and gals who have yet to share, if you will, all we can do is ask. But each one of you, as they say, had a job to do, and you've done it. If you can and will, please come and share that with us, because each one of us, as I've said many times, is a small piece in a very large puzzle. The more we can make of a concerted, clear picture, the better our families, our friends, and the guys and gals coming after us will have a better view of what's going on and how they, in turn, might be able to help make it a better world to live in. Again, Bob Stevens saying thank you for listening. Come back and see us. Stay healthy. Goodbye.